That is probably more aesthetically and culturally influential to Western readers today than any of our previous texts, the Divine Comedy. We'll only be covering the first installment of Dante's magnum opus, the Inferno. Be sure to dive deeply into Purgatorio and Paradiso, for these are all part and parcel of Dante's much larger divine scheme. Now, the Divine Comedy is theologically relevant because it, more than any other secular literature, paints a picture of the geography of the afterlife. Many texts had undertaken such a project before, like we see in The Voyage of St. Brennan, St. Patrick's Purgatory, etc., but none had ever been so ambitious in their scope than was Dante. Dante's vision is largely the vision of the afterlife shared by Christians and non-Christians today. The concept of limbo, circles of hell, working off one's penance by climbing Mount Purgatory are all direct descendants from Dante. Though Dante doesn't create the idea of purgatory, certainly not of hell, his pictures give flesh to how many people conceive of these places today. But the Divine Comedy, even more so, is aesthetically relevant for several reasons. First of all, it's highly and technically proficient. Dante spends a great deal of time on his diction, his meter, the structure of his poem. As but one quick example, each installment ends with Dante the Pilgrim looking up at the stars, and the final word of each story is stars. Further, Dante forces us to read each event in the text through the prisms of the four medieval levels of interpretation: the literal, the allegorical, the moral, and the anagogical. These views of storytelling meant that nothing was ever just as it seemed. There is, just at the surface, the plot, the event of what actually happens in the text. That's the literal. Then there's what the event means symbolically, where everything has a meaning of some sort. This is the allegorical. The third is how we should live our lives in light of what occurs in the text. This is the moral. And then finally, we should also consider what the event teaches us about Christ and of heavenly things. This is the anagogical level. So when Dante the poet begins his story midway along the journey of our life, trying to ascend a hill but being stopped by three beasts, we have to recognize not just what is happening here, but we have to ask ourselves what these things mean at all four levels of interpretation. Finally, in describing his journey through hell, purgatory, and heaven, Dante purposely tells us the history of his Italian people, with plenty of implications for what is happening in his native Florence. He is also telling the classical history of the world. Thus we meet Odysseus, Socrates, and not to mention Virgil. He's also telling us a Christian history. What happens, for instance, in the 3 days between Christ's crucifixion and resurrection? What becomes known as the harrowing of hell? Well, Dante tells us what Christ did during that time. And he's also telling a personal history, Dante's own spiritual pilgrimage from death to life, which is supposed to be an everyman tale, mirroring our own spiritual pilgrimages. Dante's journey begins as he is trying to reach the heavenly Jerusalem, but cannot. He finds himself in need of divine aid. So the Virgin Mary sends St. Lucia, who in turn sends Beatrice, the woman Dante had loved from afar in Florence in his youth. And Beatrice sends the pagan poet Virgil to lead Dante up to paradise. But they cannot get there directly, which becomes obvious when Virgil, a non-Christian, cannot lead Dante all the way. He is forced to stop at the end of the Purgatorio. Further, Dante cannot go straight. Like Augustine says, "Descend that you may first ascend, and ascend to God." And so, Dante the poet continues the classical tradition of Catabasis. Passing through the gate of hell, where it says, "Abandon all hope, you who enter here," Dante then spends the rest of the text climbing down through the 9 circles of hell, witnessing the 7 deadly sins as lived out by famous Italians and classical heroes. For example, in Limbo, Dante introduces us to the virtuous pagans, that is, those who have lived good lives, but could not have known about Jesus Christ, having lived before Christ came. We meet Plato and Aristotle, Homer, Ovid, and Virgil. These men represent the highest of man's achievements, without divine revelation. Thus they are consigned to hell, but their view of hell, while hopeless, is an image of a castle in which they sit and discuss philosophy all day long. Other intriguing episodes include when Dante meets Paolo and Francesca in the whirlwind of the lustful. He himself is so overcome by the emotions they share that he weeps for pity and passes out. This example illustrates Dante's use of the contrapasso, literally which means against the deed. Each sin which characterized a person's life is justly repaid in the afterlife by a fitting retribution. Thus the lustful are driven by their desires in life, therefore in the afterlife they are caught up in an eternal whirlwind that tosses them back and forth forever. Perhaps most powerful is Dante the Pilgrim's time spent in the ninth circle of hell, amongst the prideful. Here he sees Judas Iscariot, Brutus, and Cassius in the mouths of Satan, who is himself locked in a lake of ice at the center of the earth, his great wings beating back and forth to escape, but only serving to keep the ice frozen. There are so very many different aspects of this image to interpret, but I will leave it to your capable minds to think through. So, questions to think about when reading. Number 1. What is the physical space or geography of hell? And you can find lots of different examples of this online in picture form. But more importantly, how is this theologically appropriate and aesthetically meaningful? In such a twisted hierarchy, who rules over hell? Number 2. How might the 4 levels of interpretation be applied in each canto? As you go through and read each canto, think about how might we interpret this allegorically? How might we interpret it morally, etc. Number 3. How does each canto depict a multi-layered view of history? Where do we see Christian history intersecting with classical history, intersecting with Florentine history, and even Dante's own, which may be mirrored as a type of history for ourselves? Number 4. What is Dante's view of justice? How might this view be considered decidedly medieval? And what do you think? Is it just? Number 5. And relatedly, how does each contrapasso function? What are we to make of Dante's virtuous pagans? What are we to think about the gluttonous? About those who envy? Number 6. Why does Dante the Pilgrim participate in the sins that he witnesses? What does this say about him as a character who's in hell at the time? And what might Dante the poet be saying about us as we watch others sin? And finally, number 7. Now that we are studying works and pieces of literature that are on this side of the cross, in a world which has adopted a Christian worldview, in what ways do we see the pagans continuing their pagan worldview in hell? Godspeed your reading.